pastor was playing that guitar. I remember back when I was a Jesus freak, back in the early 70s, I remember the first Jesus rock band ever is supposed to be a group called Agape from the San Francisco Bay Area, headed with a guy named Fred Cabin in 1967. Has anybody ever heard of him or them? Okay. Sorry about that. They were the first Christian rockers. And then I'm thinking of Larry Norman, who is called the father of Christian rock, who was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, and when he was 5 moved to San Francisco. And I'm sure had a lot of bad influences here, just kidding. And Paul McCartney, when he died, said that he was the greatest lyricist in the history of rock and roll, as he produced 60 albums and had tremendous lyrics. And I'm sure a lot of that had to do with growing up in San Francisco. But nevertheless, finally, as we sang Horatio Spafford's famous song, many of y'all probably know the occasion in which he wrote it, as he had lost his, I think, 4 daughters and wife who had gone under. But do you know the rest of the story? The rest of the story is that he later remarried a Swedish lady. They moved to Israel and started what is called the American Colony, which today is a very famous hotel and all of this. And it was the first building in the late 1800s that was built outside the walls of Jerusalem. And he had a ministry to the Jewish people. And he was a Christian Zionist, one of the first Christian Zionists. And they started this American colony to try to show that Christians love Jewish people. And so he was an interesting fellow, Horatio Spafford. Well, I'm going to be talking this hour about the rapture and church history. And Dr. Ryrie said the fact that the church taught something in the first century does not make it true. And likewise, if the church did not teach something until the 20th century, it's not necessarily false. Now I say that because if you've ever been out there talking about the rapture, people will bring up the issue, well, if the rapture is so clear in the Bible, then why wasn't it seen before 1830 with Darby and all of these things, or some variation of that, or some girl, Mark Mcdonald, supposedly came up with the pre-trib rapture back in 1830. And what I want to show you tonight is that in the last 20 years, we've been able to find many people, or a number of people, who have taught pretribulationism all the way from at least the 4th century on years before Darby. And apparently people just weren't looking. And so we see, the development of millennialism, which was the big issue in the early church. And you have ancient premillennialism or Chiliasm, which dominated the early church. And then you had a rise in North Africa and Alexandria. It all came from there. And what I call anti-millennialism. There was simply were opposed to Chiliasm or premillennialism around 200, and it then developed by Augustine into amillennialism. So you have anti-millennialism, and what's interesting is that the Apostle John is the person who lived in Asia Minor who saw the book of Revelation. Of course, we know that. And a guy named Polycarp was discipled by the Apostle John, who discipled Irenaeus, who was the strong premillennialist in the 2nd century. And not only that, Eusebius, who was the first church historian in the 330s, wrote a book called Ecclesiastical History, and he says a guy named Papias was the first Chiliast, and he was a man of wee little intellect, supposedly. But he goes on and says, because Eusebius was an anti-millennialist, and he goes on and says, but Papias was discipled by the Apostle Paul and the Apostle John both. And so he is said to be the first premillennialist, even though he had wee little intellect, apparently. And they've been using that kind of language, for premillennialism ever since, because we take the Bible literally. See, if you take the Bible literally, then you cannot be an intellectual, because you don't see the deeper spiritual meanings hidden in these layered interpretations. And you hear the same kind of language today, that somehow, you've got two brains. If you're premillennialist, one's lost and the other's out looking for it, And so you then have postmillennialism is a later development derivative of amillennialism and anti-millennialism. And it, was seen by people like I was talking about, John Owen and John Cotton in the early mid-1600s, and it became popular after the Enlightenment starts, when the deist Daniel Whitby comes along and popularizes it in 1703 in his work. And then you have the revival of premillennialism, as I said, with the Puritans, 1627 with Joseph Mead. And then you have modern premillennialism, which is futurism, and around 1820 as it's revived. And only within a futurist context, can you even have the preaching of rapture. So early Christians are called Chilius, a term liberal historian Adolf Harnack says was inseparably associated with the gospel itself. Harnack further declared faith in the nearness of Christ's second advent and the establishment of his reign of glory on the earth was undoubtedly a strong point in the primitive Christian church. In other words, the fact that Christ could come at any moment. But here's an outline basically of what they believed. They believed that they were living in the last days and that Christ could come at any moment. Some have called this an intra-tribulationism. In a way, they believed they were living in the tribulation, but on the other hand, so Christ could come at any moment, and then there would be, a millennial kingdom. And you have the apostolic doctrine of imminency that abound in the church fathers. Imminency is the fact that Christ could return at any moment. And Clement of Rome, Ignatius of Antioch, the Didache, the Epistles of Barnabas, the Shepherd of Hermas, all speak of imminency. And the Shepherd of Hermas speaks of the pre-tribulational concept of escaping the tribulation. And it says, you have escaped from great tribulation on account of your faith, and because you did not doubt in the presence of such a beast, go therefore and tell the elect of the Lord his mighty deeds, and say to them that this beast is a type of the great tribulation that is coming. If you then prepare yourselves and repent with all your heart and turn to the Lord, it is possible for you to escape it. If your heart be pure and spotless, and you spend the rest of your days of your life in serving the Lord blamelessly. Yeah, you wonder where the gospel went when you go from the New Testament to the church fathers. I just made that up. There's hardly any gospel of grace until Augustine in the early church, but nevertheless, here he is Shepherd of Hermas, one of the earliest late first century extra biblical writings that talks about the possibility of escaping the tribulation. He's probably not pre-trib because he's very unclear. He's kind of back and forth on this kind of stuff, but it seems to be floating around out there. Well, a friend of mine, Grant Jeffrey, a Canadian, called me up one day when I was in my office in Washington, D.C. when I first started working at the Pretrib Research Center, and he had found this quote by a guy named Pseudo-Ephraim from 387, AD 387. And so I, living in Washington, went to the Catholic University, which has the largest patristic section, our library in America, and researched all of this thing out. And we wrote an article that was published in Bibliotheca Sacra, Dallas Seminary's Journal. If you want to read, a more detailed account of this, is in the 94 or something, 95, I think it was. And we found this sermon that, you ready for this, was in a book written by a professor from Berkeley. Right. And see, I'm weaving it in every chance I get here.
That's right.
And his name was Alexander, and he was a professor of Byzantine history, which meant, and he was from, I think originally from Russia or somewhere, and he had this novel belief. I went and read all of his articles except the one written in Russian. And I had all of his articles on this, and he had this novel idea, you know, that you could learn a lot about Byzantine history by reading what the church had to say. Isn't that amazing? You know, since the church dominated the Byzantine era, you know, imagine reading about what the church people said and all of that kind of stuff. And so he came up and was talking about the eschatology of the Byzantine early church fathers, and he came up with this statement in his book, which is what Grant Jeffrey read, the Byzantine Apocalyptic Tradition. It was written posthumously after he died in 1967, and he talked about how most people believe that the Great Tribulation was something that people would not be able to endure, except for this guy named Pseudo-Ephraim, who believed that Christians would be taken out before the tribulation. So, like I said, we went and found all of this stuff, and sure enough, here's a statement out of his sermon. And by the way, we have his sermon on our website. It was 1,459 Latin words or something like that. We paid a guy, a Latin scholar, to translate it into English. We put the English version up. But nevertheless, here is what it says in the second paragraph. Why, therefore, do we not reject every care of earthly actions and prepare ourselves for the meeting of the Lord Christ, so that he may draw us from the confusion which overwhelms all the world? And then he quoted a Bible verse from the Old Testament. For all the saints and elect of God are gathered prior to the tribulation that is to come, and are taken to the Lord, lest they see the confusion that is to overwhelm the world because of their sins. Now, he uses the word confusion to refer to the tribulation. And this is in his second paragraph. He then spends the middle paragraphs of his article, or whatever it is, letter, and talking about how bad the tribulation is going to be. And then the 9th and 10th, he talks about the second coming. So I think for all the world, he's separating the rapture from the second coming. Robert Gundry was so disturbed by this, he wrote me a letter when our article appeared in IFCA and said this caused him to think about eschatology. He's the post-tribulationalist in the 70s that wrote Church in the Tribulation, and said that our find was very intriguing. And he wrote another book in the mid-90s called First, the Antichrist. You know, that tells you something about post-tribulationalism. You know, that they believe the Antichrist has to appear first before Christ can appear. So they're looking for the Antichrist, we're looking for Christ. Kind of a little difference there. And the New Testament tells us to look for Christ, doesn't it? Not for Antichrist. And he wrote a 23-page critique of our article about this, in which he tried to argue that the language here is a reference to gathered here, doesn't refer to gathered to heaven or something like that, but it's a term used for gathering people in with evangelism. And he quoted from Ephraim. We did not argue that Ephraim wrote it. Ephraim is one of the greatest Syriac church fathers. In fact, he's the most well-known. But instead, that someone writing under his name, a pseudonym, wrote this. And the problem is all of his examples referred to clear evangelistic statements by Ephraim the Syriac, and this is clearly an eschatological context. He did not produce one example of this. He also said that it couldn't be pre-tribulational because it talks about believers in the tribulation. I mean, is that a problem for us? Because we all know that people are going to get saved after the rapture, but this was somehow a problem and things like this. So I don't think that he made any dent whatsoever, but he did admit to me in a letter that this kind of bothered him on his view of the history of the rapture. And then here's a guy, Francis Xavier Gumelach. And of course, Francis Xavier was a great Catholic guy in the 1500s. So obviously, this Gumelach, Dr. Gumelach, grew up Catholic, don't you reckon? But he's a Protestant now, and he has a PhD from St. Louis University in classics. And he is a postmillennial preterist. So you all know what all these means now, because you all have heard about all this. And they're about as polar opposite to pretribulationism and dispensationalism as you can get. But he wrote a book called The Day and the Hour, published by Gary DeMar, with a foreword by Gary DeMar's organization American Vision. And in it, he says that he found a rapture passage from the 1300s by a guy named Brother Dolcino. And he even wrote an article that was published in BibSac, Bibliothea Sacra, talking about this rapture guy, this rapture. And so here's a guy who's an opponent of what we believe, but he thinks he found a rapture from the 1300s taught by a guy named Brother Dolcino. And this was from a book called The History of Brother Dolcino. So what Gumerlock has been doing is, I don't know if you realize this, but there's over 500 volumes of Greek and Latin church fathers that have never been translated into English. You know, if you get the 3-volume set, many people say, I got the church fathers. Well, I'm sorry. There's a lot of stuff still out there. And he has read through the eschatological sections and informed himself on this. In fact, he told Mark Hitchcock and I, who have written books together, that he has in his file drawer 3 file drawers full of people from the Middle Ages who taught a form of pretribulationalism. And one day he's going to get around to publishing these. So I think that's kind of interesting. But here's an example. And he says this short Latin treatise gives a first-hand account of the deeds and beliefs of a religious order called the Apostolic Brethren. And under the leadership of Brother Dolcino, the Apostolic Brethren flourished in the author's diocese between the years 1300 and 1307. And so this text was recopied in 1551 and 1600 was used as source material for 2 other ecclesiastical histories of the area, and the treatise was later printed in the 1740s in the 25-volume, there. And it was most recently edited in 1907 with the reprint of this multi-volume set, where it contains 14 pages of volume 9. So he's showing where he came up, where he got this. And so he's talking about how they were founded in 1260. Gerard Saragello founded the Apostolic Brethren after his application for membership of the Franciscans was rejected. So what you had, this is a product of Joachim de Fiore that I mentioned earlier in the 1200s, where you had all of these eschatological or prophecy freaks, if I could use a word from the 60s and 70s, people who were getting into prophecy and all of this kind of thing, and they were trying to found orders in the Catholic Church. Now, most orders were founded to try to reform the Catholic Church. And that's, of course, what Luther was trying to do. He reformed as an adjective until he got booted out, and then reformed became a noun. In other words, a whole different thing. And so the Pope at this point, because of Joachim de Fiore, would not allow any new orders to be formed. So they formed this one anyway, called the Apostolic Brethren, and separated themselves from the Catholic Church. And they were committed to radical poverty, itinerant preaching of the gospel. However, at that time, the founding of the new religious orders, as I say, was strictly forbidden by the Pope, and consequently the Apostolic Brethren were objects of persecution. And they were in northern Italy, by the way. That's where they went, up in the mountains, with a lot of other people who were opposed to the Catholic Church. And in the 1300s, their leader, Gerard, was burned at the stake. Brother Dolcino, who had been a member of the Apostolic Brethren for a number of years, took over leadership of that order in that year. And at one point, under his leadership, the Apostolic Brethren had grown to about 4,000 members. That's kind of bad, because many, they got too big and couldn't hide much anymore in the mountains. And then the Pope sent armies up there and wiped them out. And that's why he died in 1307. So here we have Joachim de Fiore that I talk about, and they went and preached the gospel, and the persecuted order under Dolcino's leadership withdrew to the mountainous area of northern Italy, but the size of the order and their need for daily sustenance resulted in clashes with local authority. In 1306, a bull was drawn up by Pope Clement V, and a crusade was launched against it. In 1307, over 400 members of the Apostolic Brethren were slaughtered by the papal forces. Dolcino was captured, mutilated, and burned at the stake. So, this is what he taught, though. He believed and preached and taught that within those 3 years, Dolcino himself and his followers will preach the coming of the Antichrist, talking about the tribulation period, and that the Antichrist was coming into the world within the bounds of the said 3.5 years, and after he had come, then he, in other words, Dolcino and his followers would be transferred into paradise, in which were Enoch and Elijah. And in this way, they will be preserved unharmed from the persecution of Antichrist. There was the last 3.5 years. So you have a two-event that he's talking about, a pre-trib rapture in the middle of the tribulation, apparently, before the Antichrist comes, and then, of course, the second coming, as we'll see here in a moment. So it's and in this way, they will be preserved unharmed from the persecution of Antichrist. And that then Enoch and Elijah themselves would descend on earth for the purpose of preaching against Antichrist. Then they would be killed by him or by his servants, and thus Antichrist would reign for a long time. But when the Antichrist is dead, Dolcino himself, who would then be the Holy Pope, isn't that great? He gets to be Pope at the end. I mean, that's pretty good. And his preserved followers will descend on earth and will preach the right faith of Christ to all, and will convert those who were living then to the true faith of Jesus Christ. So, here's a movement that taught this. As Gumerlock says, for this 14th century text, the history of Brother Dolcino shows us that some Christians in the Middle Ages held a view of the rapture that had basic elements of what we call today a pre-tribulation rapture. These include a significant gap of time between the rapture of the saints and their subsequent descent to earth, and the purpose of the rapture related to escaping end-time tribulation. And in this basis, I submit my case for expanding the historical boundaries of pretribulationism, once again by non-pretribulationists. So he hit the nail on the head, especially in need of rethinking, or he says, are those views which place the origin of the teaching or its initial recovery within the last 200 years. So that's a critic. And as I say, he's told Mark Hitchcock and I about the stuff that he has, and hopefully he'll do this in a while. Now, some have claimed that there were pre-trib rapture statements by people like Joseph Mead and a bunch of other Protestants. But when you look at them closely, what you have instead is this two-stage, 45-day pre-conflagration rapture view that was taught extensively by Joseph Mead, the father of Premillennialism, in 1627. He has a whole booklet on this very topic. And so this is not a form of pretribulationism, because he believes that it's an interval related to the second coming where believers, he uses the word rapture, 1 Thessalonians 4, are caught up and hover above the earth for 45 days while Christ renovates the earth, 2 Peter 3, and then they come back down. And he sees it as part of the second coming. And so that view was, somewhat widely held. And this was the book that he wrote. I'll just read the title, a paraphrase and exposition of the prophecies of St. Peter concerning the day of Christ's second coming, described in the 3rd chapter of his second epistle, as also how the conflagration or destruction of the world by fire, whereof St. Peter speaks, and especially of the heavens, is to be understood. I mean, publishers would not publish a book with that title now. Sorry. Some books are shorter than this title. But nevertheless, he taught at Cambridge and was one of the greatest Reformed scholars of his day, and he considered the father of English premillennialism, but advanced not futurism, but historicism, the day-year view. And so I'm saying that this is not a form of pre-tribulationism. So it goes up in smoke. But namely, he says, I will add this more, namely that what may be conceived to be the cause of this rapture of the saints on high to meet the Lord in the clouds, rather than to wait his coming to the earth. What if it be that they may be preserved during the conflagration of the earth and the works thereof, 2 Peter 3:10, that as Noah and his family were preserved through the deluge by being lifted up above the waters in the ark, so shall the saints, as the conflagration, be lifted up into the clouds into their ark, Christ, to be preserved there from the deluge of fire, wherein the wicked shall be consumed. So this is the judgment at the second coming that he's talking about being delivered from, not the tribulation. Even though he has a two-stage coming, it's related to second coming. So a number of people have thought that this was pre-tribulationism through the years, but it's not. Then you have Increased Mather, for example, and he held this two-stage coming, and some scholars, have tried to say that he taught pre-tribulationism. A dissertation concerning the future conversion of the Jewish nation, 1709. The living saints at Christ's coming shall be caught up in the air, that they may escape the deluge of fire, which will be the perdition of ungodly men. But before the rapture of the living, the dead saints will be raised. So it's clearly that pre-conflagration view, and he quotes Joseph Mead here as well. Cotton Mather, we didn't show a picture of him earlier, but there he is in all his glory, with a very nice wig he chose for the picture. And he wrote a very extensive treatise, Triparadisius, in 1730 on eschatology. He probably did that, in between video games, don't you think? And he says, the saints shall be caught up to meet the Lord, our God, having thus made up his jewels and snatched away all that he had any value for, the earth now left with none but the wicked upon it. The vial of divine wrath are poured out upon the world. During this time the saints will be safe, caught up to the place where the Lord will have his holy ones with him at such a safe distance from the earth as to deliver them from the wrath to come and from the flames of a world of fire. They're using rapture language. They're trying to deal with the two comings, you see, the rapture and the second coming, but it's not pre-tribulational. So you see a lot of this kind of stuff, especially in the 1600s. In fact, there's a guy who, here we go again, got his PhD at Berkeley. How come nobody went to Stanford? I don't know. But that's it, couldn't afford it. They weren't rich elite guys. And this guy's a graduate of Talbot, and he has a PhD from Berkeley in 17th and 18th century British history. And nowadays, in the last 5 years, you can go on the internet. For example, I have these privileges as a member of the Liberty faculty, and you can get just about any book from Bosco. Some of you may know what that means. That's an acronym for some sites that you can go on, and you can download just about any book from the 15, 16, 17, 1800s and get PDF copies. You can go to Google Books and get a bunch of them for free. But if you have the Bosco account, which he does and I have, and he's been going through and reading all of this eschatology stuff, and he has found, he sent me his paper, he wants to get it published, and so I can't tell you the examples that he's given me. He's clearly given 2 or 3 guys just from the 1600s that taught a form of pre-tribulationism, you see. Because people are now, from our camp, are gaining access to this material and are doing research and finding that people did indeed talk about the rapture. It was certainly more sophisticated than we believed before. You see what I'm saying? You have the conflagration view and all this other stuff mixed up in there. And so it's not as what it used to be. So Cotton Mather says, our God having thus made up his jewel, well, I've already read that, hadn't he? And he says, the divine vials of divine wrath are poured out upon the world. During this time the saints will be safe, caught up to the place where the Lord will have his holy ones with him. I've already read that as well. And so he's another pre-conflagration rapture guy. You have John Gill, who taught that, the hyper-Baptist, hyper-Calvinist rather. You have Thomas Burnett, who taught it. You had Manuel de la Conza, who is supposedly the person that influenced Edward Irving, who then supposedly influenced the Brethren and Darby. You have, because Edward Irving translated Manuel de la Conza, who was a Jesuit priest who wrote a book in the late 1700s on prophecy, and he had the pre-conflagration view in there. You have Pierre Bernard Lambert, a Janist from France, and those were people, especially in the late 1700s, who basically were Catholic Calvinists who tended to be premillennial. Figure that one out. Okay, and Jean Aguirre, who's another one of those, another Frenchman. You had Edward Irving, who I mentioned. You had various Urbanites in the Urbanite movement, which I don't have time to get into to explain. And a guy named John Askell in 1700 wrote a book called An Argument Proving that according to the covenant of eternal life revealed in the scriptures, man may be translated from hence into that eternal life without passing through death, although the human nature of Christ himself could not be thus translated till he had passed through death. You don't have to read the book. Actually, I found a copy of his book at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. It was 92 pages. I read the book. And his book was burned, examined and pronounced blasphemous, and has been burnt by order of the House without his having been heard in its defense, or he didn't get to defend himself. Half the book is him saying, I know nobody's going to like what I'm saying, but I'm going to say it anyway. And this guy, he was removed from the Irish Parliament in 1703 and from the English Parliament in 1707. He spent the last 30 years in prison because of his book on the rapture, that it could happen at any moment. You know, they weren't too open to these ideas, and so people wonder, why weren't there more pre-tribulationists, or rapture guys around? Well, some of them got put in jail, some of them burned at the stake, these kinds of things. But here's a guy named Morgan Edwards, who is a Welshman, and Morgan Edwards, in 1840, attended Bristol Baptist College. He graduated in 1744, and he pastored churches, and he was ordained to the ministry by John Gill, so he was a hyper-Calvinist. And he then, after 14 or 15 years, immigrated to the United States and became pastor of the First Baptist Church of Philadelphia. Baptists were late immigrants to the United States. It was one of the last people groups to start immigrating to the United States. And he founded Brown University, an Ivy League school. The Rhode Island College, it was called originally, in Rhode Island. And he became the father of American Baptist history. So he's a fairly important guy, in the development of Baptist history and those kinds of things. Well, in 1740, when he was at Bristol Baptist College, he wrote an essay on eschatology. And in it, he lays out a very strong, clear pre-trib rapture viewpoint in it. He wrote it in Latin originally. Of course, they wrote everything in Latin back then. And then in 1788, he translated it into English, and it was published in Philadelphia. And I got a copy of it at the Library of Congress. We photocopied it, and we modernized the English, and it's up on our website if you want to read his entire 50-something page book. It's up there on our preacher website. And he obviously preached up and down the eastern seaboard, and he had, other than his history book and a book on how to raise money for colleges, he had hundreds of sermons in handwritten manuscript booklet form that were never published, and this is the only one that was. So obviously he cared about it, and he obviously must have preached this view up and down the eastern seaboard of the United States back in the 1770s, 1780s, you see. And this is well before Darby. And so here is some of what he says. He says the distance between, and by the way, at the beginning of his book, he gives a defense of why he takes the view that he does. He says there's already been much written based on allegorical interpretation. And he says he's going to interpret the Bible literally and be different. And so he was. And he says the distance between the first and second resurrection will be somewhat more than 1,000 years. I say somewhat more because the dead saints will be raised and the living changed at Christ appearing in the air. And he gives 1 Thessalonians 4:17, the rapture passage. And this will be about 3.5 years before the millennium. Now he believed that the entire length of the tribulation was 3.5 years. So he's pre-trib. As we shall see hereafter, but will he and they abide in the air all that time? No, they will ascend to paradise, or to one of those many mansions in the Father's house, just the way we use John 14:2. And so disappear during the foresaid period, the tribulation period. The design of this retreat and disappearing will be to judge the risen and changed saints, for now the time has come for judgment to begin, and it will begin at the house of God. In other words, just like we believe today that the Bema judgment is going to take place in heaven during the tribulation. And so, what has he said? Well, I've already said it, made these comments here. And so he's like a modern pre-tribulationist that links, tribulation with the Bema judgment. And he goes on in another place and says, another event previous to the millennium will be the appearing of the Son of Man in the clouds, coming to raise the dead saints and change the living, and to catch them up to himself, and then withdraw with them as observed before. In other words, in page 7 where we quoted earlier. This event will come to pass when Antichrist be arrived at Jerusalem in his conquest of the world, and about 3 years and a half before his killing the witnesses and assumption of the Godhead. The last event, and the event that will usher in the millennium, will be the coming of Christ from paradise to the earth with the saints he had taken up thither about 3.5 years before. Millions and millions of saints will have been on earth from the day of the first Adam to the coming of the second Adam. All these will Christ bring with him. So he believed, like Darby, also believed that all believers, not just church age believers, will be raptured at the rapture. And we don't believe that, because we believe it's just the church, and that other saints from previous eras will be resurrected at the second coming. So the place where they will alight is the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east. In fact, this was so clear that a guy named John Bray, a full preterist, had for years offered a $500 reward to anybody that can find a pre-Darby rapture statement, and he paid up on this. It's one thing for these guys to offer this, a lot of times they just won't pay up. He actually paid up $500 and said he wasn't going to set any more things up when the guy that came up with this revealed it. And brother and researcher Frank Moretta believes that Thomas Collier in 1674 made a reference to a preacher of rapture but rejected the view, thus showing his awareness that such a view was being taught. Now, I've read this book. In fact, you can download a copy, I think, off of Google Books of Thomas Collier's Systematic Theology. I read this section in the British Library in 2003. So he writes of Collier, because he raised the question of the saints being raised at Christ's first appearing in the clouds of heaven instead of later on at the interest of 1,000 years, it is apparent that Collier certainly considered the idea of a preacher of rapture, but he rejected it. And my friend William Watson, who is doing this research, has found, he believes, the people that Collier was referring to who taught a preacher of rapture. And so we're finding increasingly more and more people that taught pretribulationism. See, what's missing in Darby's system more than the pre-trib rapture was the distinction between Israel and the church. That is the real new thing, you know, that Israel is distinct and has a distinct prophetic future from the church. Okay, so here's Darby's rapture views were clearly a result of his own study of Scripture. And they are a product of his view in the church as distinct from Israel and from his futurist eschatology. Now, what you have is the fact that Darby, who was born in London and was christened, you know, in the Anglican Church. Lord Nelson, the famous British admiral, was his godfather, and that's why he's named John Nelson Darby, because Darby's uncle was the top admiral under Lord Nelson at the Battle of Trafalgar. Forget that. Yeah, Trafalgar, exactly. And so Lord Nelson was his godfather. Darby was from a wealthy family. His mother grew up in Philadelphia, interestingly enough, and he won a gold medal winner at Trinity, Dublin, in Ireland, and because his family was ancestrally from Ireland. And so he was a classic scholar. He did not study any Bible or theology except, you know, as part of his curriculum in classics. They did have to go to Saturday lectures on the Bible there at Trinity College for no credit back in the day. And he was born in 1800, so he died in 1882. So he's easy to, you know, to keep his dates in mind. And he then went to law school and basically graduated from law school, and probably somewhere during law school is when he became a believer. And he basically surrendered to the ministry when he graduated from law school, and his father disinherited him, you know, because he was disappointed he wasn't going to go out and be this famous lawyer or judge or whatever. And he then was ordained as into the Anglican Church, and for 26 months he was an Anglican minister serving south of Dublin in what's called the Wicklow area. I was there this summer when we went to Powerscourt Castle, the most famous castle in Ireland, and you can see the Wicklow Mountains south of there. And Darby and some others in the Anglican Church were winning 600 to 800 people a week to Christ as an Anglican minister. And one of his bishops was upset that the hoi polloi, in other words, the riffraff of the Irish people who were not upper class, were coming into the Anglican Church. And so he made a requirement that they have to pledge allegiance to the British Crown in order to join the Anglican Church. And Darby's evangelism was dried up overnight as a result of that. So Darby is very down on the Anglican Church, needless to say. And he had developed opinions that the church-state situation was a very carnal, non-Christian setup. And in October of 1827, he was riding on his horse, and it bumped him up against a fence, and he hurt his leg. And he had to convalesce at his sister's house in Dublin, Ireland. His sister was married to a guy who would eventually become the chief of the Supreme Court of Ireland. And while he was recuperating for those 3 to 4 months is when he read nothing but the Bible within the mindset of his disappointment in the established church, you see. And so his focus was on the church. And this is when he says that he came up with his ideas of pretribulationism. There's over 5 or 6 references in his writing about this. And here's what he found. Darby's pre-trib and dispensational thoughts were developed from the following factors. Number one, he saw from Isaiah 32 that there was a different dispensation coming, that Israel and the church were distinct. And he was probably, up to this time, a post-millennialist, even. Secondly, during his convalescence, John Nelson Darby learned that he ought daily to expect his Lord's return. In fact, his logic was that the church is already positionally with Christ in heaven, and therefore it will just change with the rapture when physically we're brought to what our position is in Christ. That was his logic, be it right or wrong. Thirdly, in 1827, Darby understood the fall of the church, or what he calls the ruin of the church, the apostate church. And then fourthly, Darby also was beginning to see a gap of time between the rapture and the second coming by 1827 or 1828. So it's during his convalescence time in December 1827, January 1828. Darby himself said in 1857 that he first started understanding these things relating to the pre-trib rapture 30 years ago. So, this guy Hubner says it's January 31st, 1827. I think he's a year off, but either way, I think it was January 1828. Personally declares that we can see that Darby had already understood these truths upon which the pre-trib rapture hinges. Now, Darby originally, for 15 years, thought the rapture, or the tribulation, was 3.5 years long. It wasn't until 1845 that he begins to see a 7-year tribulation. And Darby also was not confident that he was right for a decade or more, even though he shared his views with some people. So he didn't start aggressively teaching this until more like the 1840s. But, however, in my research, I have found there are two verifications of this. Number one is Francis Newman, who's the younger brother of Cardinal Newman, if you've ever heard of the Oxford movement or any of this kind of stuff. He's a guy that wanted to take the Anglican Church back to Roman Catholicism. And Francis Newman was a tutor in Darby's sister's house at the time when Darby was convalescing. And Francis Newman, in his book, Phases of Faith, writes about his encounter with Darby and confirms that Darby told him about the pre-trib rapture during his convalescence period. And secondly, another gentleman visited Darby during this time and wrote a letter to his brother, also mentioning that Darby had taught, about the rapture and the change of dispensation, or premillennialism and these other things. So this is historical confirmation that by January 1828, Darby had held a Pretribulationism, and Margaret Mcdonald didn't come along until April 1830, and Darby could not have been influenced by any urbanite stuff because it came a few months after he had already come to this view. And the reason I bring this up is because I have listed in some of my writings literally hundreds of books and articles that say that Darby got the pre-trib rapture from the Urbanites. Now, why is that bad? Because the Urbanites basically were the first charismatics. Well, actually, the Mormons were. Joseph Smith and his people were the first people to speak in tongues in the modern times. And right on their heels were the Urbanites, and they received all this prophecy and all this kind of stuff. And so they were basically the first charismatics. And therefore, it's deemed as coming from an illicit source. And Margaret Mcdonald is a 15-year-old girl who was up in Scotland. The Urbanites were in London, so she wasn't even involved with the Urbanite movement there. And so they try to say that this girl who went in a trance and received this revelation taught Pretribulationism. And of course, if you read it, there's nothing like Pretribulationism. She's simply talking about being enlightened to be able to see that the second coming is near, not Pretribulationism. But even if it was, she clearly did it after Darby had already come to these views. And further, if there's no one that you can name among neither Edward Irving nor the Urbanites ever taught a pre-trib rapture. If they're the source of the pre-trib rapture, then how come none of them ever taught it? You see, what they taught instead was the pre-conflagration view, you see. that right before Christ's coming. And so you have people reading these documents who aren't familiar with what people have taught down through church history. So if the pre-conflagration view is the preacher of rapture, then we have a lot of examples of that from the early 1600s, but it's not. And so I believe that the preacher of rapture was revived by Darby as a result of his personal Bible study. Darby lived an impeccable life. He never got married, because so he could serve Christ longer. And, he wasn't a guy who had sin in his life and all of that. Now, people criticize him because they basically, he separated from people that were taught false doctrine, and so as a result, a lot of people criticize him for that. But nevertheless, I think the preacher of rapture was revived by Darby with the theological system that goes with it. That's another thing. Darby developed the doctrine and also had the accompanying theological rationale to go with it, which shows that he developed it from his Bible study. As we close, any quick questions about this? Now, I've been hounded by this for years. That's why I've done a study on it. And some people will send me letters or give me a book like, did you hear the real origins of the preacher of rapture? Like, we've never heard this, before. And, like if you read this propaganda here, then you won't believe in the preacher of rapture anymore and everything. And so that's why I wanted to deal with this, in this last session. Any questions or comments here? Yes?
Going back to the previous lecture on the government of Israel,
yes,
and their policy, we agree that we're not supposed to expect their, the millennial ethic from the Israelites. How are we to make the kind of bad policies and, unbiblical policies that the government makes while we pray for peace in Jerusalem, love our Jewish neighbors, and try to share the gospel? And what do we make of policies of the government?
Yeah. Well, I think especially labor has made a lot of bad policies. But to me, the same way that a person may love America but disagree with what they're doing. I think it's the same kind of thing. And we're not saying, that everything Israel does is right. But we are saying, that I'm saying that God in His providence would not have brought the country back if He wouldn't have allowed it to occur. Because He, you cannot, Acts 17 says that Paul said in Mars Hill that God in the past have let people go their own way, but now He is forming the boundaries and the times of the people so that men may seek after God. See, people don't seek after God. So He causes countries to rise and fall. And, God has brought them back providentially. You have all the prophecies that say that. So obviously, I think they are going to make some wrong decisions and bad decisions and stuff. But I think the general statement that Israel has stolen the land from the Palestinians is just flat wrong. If you want to know, have documentation for that, I recommend Joan Peters' book, From Time Immemorial. Joan Peters was a liberal person from the University of Wisconsin. She went to work, I think, in the 70s for the United Nations. She went over to the Middle East. She was very pro-Palestinian. She was going to write a book. She was going to research and write a book showing how the Jews have stolen their land. She was in the bunker in 1982 in Beirut with Arafat. She was buddy-buddy. And so after that, she's able to basically go to the county courthouses, research most ownership of most pieces of land, and she flipped. She said that the information's just not there. They didn't steal the land. They bought it, most of it with the Israel Fund. For the last 300 years, the Jews have taken collections, at synagogue every week, for the Jews, the poor Jews that live in Jerusalem, because many European Jews in the 1700s, 1800s, early 1900s would go to Jerusalem to die. so they could be buried in the Holy Land. And they're being under Sharia law, they were not allowed to prosper. And so world Jewry started collecting funds hundreds of years ago to help support the Jews that lived in Israel because they were so poor. And it's called the Israel Fund. And just as we often have kids like take up a collection in Sunday school for missionaries and things, they would do something similar. And it was administered by the evil Rothschilds, of Europe. And the Israel Fund accumulated a lot of money over the years, and that's what they used starting in the 1880s to buy land for Jews. And many of the Arab landowners were absentee landlords that sold them large blocks of land, and the Israel Fund, in fact there's controversy today. There's a lot of land that the Israel Fund paid for that Arabs have squatted on. And they're trying to get the Jewish government to get the Arabs off of this land that is owned by Jews and everything. So if anything, you have just the opposite. And most Jews were careful. I'm not saying no one person at any time never stole any land. There probably are a few examples, but by and large, Joan Peters documents that that did not happen. That they have come in there and purchased the land, and basically what you had were, and there aren't many indigenous Arabs in the land of Israel because hardly anybody lived in the land of Israel as you go back and compare the census from as early as the 1830s and stuff of Jerusalem that the Ottoman Empire would do every 10 years. And the majority of Jerusalem was always Jewish, like in the 60-something percentile. And there were probably 10% or less were Arabs. You had 15 or so % Turks, and then you had like 12 or 13% Christians, who were there with churches and things like that, from other countries. And when Israel started becoming prosperous, that's when the Arabs started immigrating. Like we have in the United States. As America became prosperous, people started coming over to Rio Grande to get a job. And there aren't prosperous Arab economies unless they have oil. Because the Sharia law prevents a certain level of prosperity. And so Israel was becoming prosperous, and this is what she documents in her book, that most Arabs had been there only a few years, and then they come in and claim, that they're this ancient people. And in 1964, Arafat invents the Palestinian people because his Czechoslovakian handlers had told him that, look, we're losing the PR battle because it's the Arab-Israeli conflict. You're old enough to remember when it was called the Arab-Israeli conflict. And so they said, Israel's David and you're Goliath, because there's 23 Arab nations. And therefore they, as Newt Gingrich said, the Palestinians are an invented people. He's right, he's a historian, he knows that Arafat then took the term Palestinian in 1964 and started calling themselves Palestinians. And so you have this propaganda that's been going on ever since, that these ancient Palestinians, are indigenous. They've even got stuff being taught now, that Jesus was a Palestinian. And that the first Christians were Palestinians. No, really, I'm serious, there are books. There's a professor over at Wheaton teaching this. They buy into that. In fact, I wrote an article called Christian Palestinianism. It's one thing to have the church replace Israel, but in some instances you're having Islam replace the church. Because these Islamic ideas are coming into some of these radical things, and they're basically adopting Islamic beliefs in the church, which radicalizes, these Christians. And for example, you had 92% Christian Arabs who have been there a long time. In Bethlehem, a lot of Christians, Arabs in Nazareth. Okay, I remember my wife and I went to Israel on our honeymoon in January 1973. And we remember going there, and Bethlehem was this nice little small town with, Christian Arabs, and we had great talks with them, and, in the shops and everything. And then you have the peace accords in 1994, where the Muslims took over control of these lands. Today, there is less, it's in single digits, the number of Christians that live in Bethlehem. Why? They're being purged by the Muslims. They don't put that on television. I was there in the mid-90s. I was sitting in Bethlehem Square, and some guy he says his name was Jesus Christ, or Jesus or something, and he had an electrical engineering degree from the University of Cairo, and he wanted to know, could I help him get to the United States? Because they were just 3 or 4 months from the accord setting in. He said, we will be killed. And that's what's happened to most of those people there. And yet then you have all of these pro-Palestinian Christians out there saying that Israel's to blame. They blame Israel for this. Well, when Israel was in control, there's articles that have demographics in it. The Christian Arab population continued to slightly grow. The moment that the Muslims took over is when it goes down. You see, but they still say it's Israel that's persecuting the Christians there. It's ridiculous. And if you want to have a broader illustration, look at Lebanon. Lebanon was 2/3 a Christian country in around 1980. And then the Muslims started coming in from Syria and other places, and they would set up checkpoints, and at night, and if a Christian, a car would come, they'd stop them. Are you Christian or Muslim? If you're not going to convert to Islam, then they'd shoot you. I'm not making this up. And this is how they brought Islam down, to wipe out all these Christians. And everywhere where you've had Iraq, where you've done away with, Saddam Hussein and these others. See, Saddam Hussein used a lot of the Christians because they're always more successful in these Arab countries than the Muslims themselves are. They're usually the businessmen and doctors and educated people. And they were protected, under Saddam Hussein. And they could trust him because they had all the infighting, especially in Iraq, among the Sunnis and all this. And they would often get Christians in high positions, to do things there. And once Saddam Hussein's gone, what's happened? They're either getting out of there as fast as they can, or they're getting killed. And all the same thing in Egypt. Egypt, in the Middle Ages, was the second largest Christian country in the world. Bigger than, I think there's only one country in the world that was bigger Christian-wise in the Middle Ages. It wasn't Europe. And Islam, even under Islam, comes in now and is as high as 20 to 25% of Egyptians are still Christians. And now they're getting slaughtered, when these Islamic things take over. So this is the same kind of propaganda that they use in Israel, see, and they put this out when they captured the Church of Nativity in Bethlehem a few years ago. Do you think those priests are going to go up there and say the Muslims are persecuting us? No, because they know when the Israelis left that they would be killed or persecuted. So they're real quiet. One Greek Orthodox priest snuck out and clandestinely he said, well, it's the Muslims who, are persecuting us and all this kind of stuff. But they're afraid to talk about all of those kinds of things because the Muslims will come in and kill you. And all of those kinds of things. So there's just so much propaganda going on over there. And in Israel, the different religions have all prospered and grown when Israel's in control of that part, of a certain part of the country. And they bend over backwards to try to be nice. But, when they start, killing your people, suicide bombing and everything, they've got to defend themselves.
I have a follow-up question, guys. Do sufficient militarily and economically to defend herself against her Muslim neighbors without U.S. intervention?
I do, but it would have to be a quick war, and they would need resupply. They make a lot of their own munitions and stuff nowadays, so they could have an extended war to some extent. But you know, their basic platforms like jet fighters and things they get from the United States, and then they do it. Israel, by the way, has a very large defense industry now, and
they make their own tanks.
They do the Merkava tank, and they have something from Raphael Systems. That's their big military industrial complex thing that. You know, can with radars and everything, it keeps, it provides a shield of protection where they're not hit. They use electronics and all this stuff, and they are able to explode rounds coming in on their tanks. And they've had this for a year now. They've been in battle a few times, and it's worked perfectly every time. The Americans said it's impossible to do, just like they said the arrow system thing was impossible, but they did it. And they're now going to be able to make their tanks much lighter, faster, and all of this because they've got these electronic shields, you know, that knock down the rounds that come in. And you know, there's all kinds of stuff. No, I think Israel could. I think Iran is overrated militarily. They're out blabbing off all this stuff that they're going to do. And the United States said just the other day that, you know, that we will prevent the Iranians from mining the harbor, and that we will be able to do it, and we will be able to defend ourselves from anything that they have. Okay, Israel, if they go in and attack Iran, is going to do it with missiles. They're not going to fly in their planes. And Israel's one of the few countries in the world that has a nuclear triad. You know, air, submarines, and land. And also, Israel is the only country in the world that has neutron bombs. Now, America developed those in the 70s, and neutron bombs are nuclear bombs that give a nuclear blast, but in 24 to 36 hours, the radiation dissipates or goes away. And Jimmy Carter, in all of his wisdom, decided we didn't need them because he was negotiating peace. And it was designed originally to keep the Russians from coming over the Khyber Pass, and our tanks would have used these smaller nuclear things to wipe out the Russian tanks had they come into Europe. And so Israel went ahead and developed neutron bombs, and I think that they have built what we call bunker, you know, neutron bombs as bunker buster bombs that can go down 200 feet into the ground and then have a nuclear explosion. And I think they could deliver a lot of those without having the big, you know, 40,000-pound bombs that we have. You know, I don't think they need it. But they also don't need stealth aircraft because they went into Syria. They use electronics to make their aircraft stealth and all this kind of stuff. So they got a lot more than they realize, but they cannot handle a long, drawn-out conflict. They're going to. I think they could do it by themselves because once they strike, then Iran's going to go after America too. So America would be drawn in. In fact, almost every European country has some kind of ship, or even the Charles de Gaulle has been brought out of mothballs by the French, you know, aircraft carrier, and it's over there in the Middle East right now. And even in Britain has mine sweepers and all this kind of stuff. Everybody's over there sitting around waiting. Yes?
Short answer. In the area of pre-trib and pre-mill, it seems like the pre-trib position, and I'm thinking of you as possibly coaching young budding preachers, and where they emphasize in their pulpit ministry. It seems like the pre-trib is sometimes not held in the great reverence that the pre-mill position is. I'm not sure if I'm saying that right, but I mean, I've heard Mark in his talked about, people who believe in pre-trib won't buy green bananas, and
Right, those are funnies.
And and those kinds of things. And do you think that, I guess, where would you put your emphasis if you're telling young
Well,
preachers?
Dr. Walford, back in the 30s when he started coming online, postmillennialism was the big deal back then that they were fighting. And he said that he was going to focus on the millennial issue. But then after a decade or so, he realized that the same hermeneutical, exegetical, and theological issues involved in the millennial issue are involved in the rapture issue.
Right.
And that's when he decided to shift his emphasis to pretribulationalism, because if you give up pretribulationalism, inevitably you'll lose people to premillennialism. And I was there in the 70s when you had a lot of people who were rediscovering Reformed theology and all of this, and I had one friend who went home one night and he read Oswald Alice, in the church, and overnight he became an amillennialist. And I had other friends who became post-trib, and every one of them to this day is amil. Some are post-mil now. So, Walford always said that there are two basic systems of theology. Number one is amillennialism that allegorizes everything. And on the other end is dispensational pre-trib premillennialism, which is the outworking of consistent literalism. And he said everything else is a blend of the two systems. And a thinking person, will be able to, if they buy a hybrid system, is going to go one way or the other, you see, on these issues. And so I think you have to defend everything, because really we're defending the literal interpretation of Scripture, and pre-tribulationalism is interwoven through the fabric of the New Testament. And you can't just say, I'm not going to teach that. You can't. People do. They try, because we're at this church growth church, and we don't want to do controversial stuff, so we don't do that. But you can't really properly teach through the Bible without teaching all of these doctrines, in their fullness. So I wouldn't choose one over the other. Yes.
Since some of you said Catholic, I was wondering, as far as Christian Zionism, if there are any Christian Zionists that you would see yourself as, that you would separate from. Because I think, for instance, when some people hear that, they hear everything of John Hagee.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, I would separate from John Hagee, who believes that Jews don't have to be saved through the gospel. But there is internationally, especially in Europe, there are all kinds of Christian Zionists who hold to a whole spectrum of beliefs. And many of them believe, that Israel's fulfilling, the full complement of prophecies of the end time right now. We wouldn't buy that. You have many Christian Zionists that are anti-dispensationalists, especially from Europe. And so there's a whole spectrum, just because someone's a Christian Zionist. But there's no doubt that dispensationalism is the leading brand of Christian Zionism that's out there. And all the books, I have at least a dozen books written in the last 5 or 6 years against Christian Zionism. It's like they all discovered it all of a sudden one day. And they all characterize Christian Zionism as dispensationalism, and they're wrong when they do that. There's all kinds of Christians. John Hagee does not believe that Jewish people have to be saved through the gospel. And my friends, like Arnold Flickenbaum and others, say that John Hagee is one of the most dangerous guys on the planet, because the worst thing you can do is not preach the gospel to a Jewish person. It's the worst thing you can do. And so they try to buddy with Israel and all of this and not preach the gospel. And I'm totally opposed to people who get involved in organizations that say, we're not going to preach the gospel to Jewish people. Because that's our number one calling, right? As the pastor prayed to the Jew first and also to the Gentiles.
Thank you, brother.
Thank you.